This episode of Around the Layout is brought to you by Weather My Trains. Hey, are you like me and the thought of doing a DIY weathering job on an expensive engine leaves you in fear? It's time to call in Rob Arsenault at Weather My Trains. Do what thousands of satisfied customers have done and let Rob help you notch up the realism on your layout with beautifully detailed weathering on your locomotives and rolling stock. To see what Rob can do for you, check out his website at weathermytrains.com. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Around the Layout, where model railroaders come to tell their story. My name is Ray Arnott. So glad you could join us. Joining me from the United Kingdom, Steve McEwen. Steve, welcome to the show.
Hi, Ray. Lovely to be here. Lovely to finally speak to you.
Yeah, it's great to connect with you. We're recording this episode in the early morning hours, which kind of aligns to the schedule. We've been able to kind of gap the difference, and it took a little while for us to make that align, but so glad we were able to do that. Boy, you gave such a glowing recommendation to the podcast on your channel, The British Railroader, and I really appreciate that. And the one thing that really stood out to me, and I mentioned this to Paul, is just how much more profound things sound when somebody with a British accent says them. So at the end of the podcast, I'm going to give you a whole bunch of my sayings, and we're going to record them just to give them some credibility with your accent. So be ready for that at the end of the show.
Absolutely. Happy to do that. Yeah, we do have a certain amount of gravitas, I think. Even, we can say the most stupid things, but they do sound quite formal when we say them with an English accent.
Well, yeah, it does. Like you said, credibility and gravitas, and appreciate all those kind words, and looking forward again to getting to know a bit more about you. I mean, you've been able to put out quite a bit of your content on your YouTube channel, and you share layout updates, but really interested to hear how you got started, because ultimately we're going to get to a question of how the heck did you end up modeling an American railroad in the UK, but we'll get to that point.
Yeah.
First, let me ask you, how did you get started in the model railroad hobby?
Do you know what? I've been thinking about this quite a lot in the last sort of couple of weeks, and because I didn't start off as a kid with trains. When I was a kid, I was very into science fiction. Star Wars was around, that kind of thing, and but I loved Lego. And in about 1981, when I was, I think it was about 8 years old, I fell ill and couldn't walk and had to go to hospital. And my parents bought me a brand new 12-volt Lego train set. I think it was Lego's first one. And that kind of started me on that, getting into trains. And, I enjoyed running the trains and kind of building towns around the stations out of Lego. And that kind of started to wane a little bit in my teenage years. And in the mid-80s, I started commuting to school for what we call secondary school, which I assume you guys would call high school or so, that kind of thing.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, and I started commuting by train. And up until that point, I'd never really traveled by train. The only times I ever went on the train was if I went to London and went on the London Underground, which is a very different rail system than, the main lines. And so I started traveling by train, and I started taking notice of what was happening. The line that I traveled on was run by diesel units, which was quite uncommon even then in the UK. That then got electrified, and I started to think, oh, this is quite good. So in 1987, when I was about 14, my parents came to me and said, well, what do you want for Christmas? And I was a very untypical teenager. I didn't like music. I didn't like fashion. I didn't like sports. But I quite liked still that building thing. So I said to them, can I have a train set? So they bought me a Hornby Intercity 125. And that was it. I was hooked. And it's probably been the most expensive decision my parents ever made on my behalf in my childhood. And my wife continues to not thank them to this day.
Well, I'll tell you what. There's worse things that you could be indoctrinated with by your parents. That's for
Oh,
sure.
absolutely,
Model
absolutely.
railroading's a good one, and like I like to say on the take a Mad Lib and fill it in, right? Just put blank and put expensive and write noun underneath the thing. Anything that you start to do, you start to find expense in, and it doesn't matter. I mean, you can buy a boat, you can buy golf clubs, and golf gets expensive. So it all gets expensive and full of money. So
I think it's like that internet meme that goes around about get your kids into model railways, then they'll never have money for drugs.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. That's for sure.
It has been the biggest cost in my life, but I couldn't do without it.
Yeah, that's for sure. And I'm sure a lot of came out of that. So you get this first train set. You said about 14 years old or so. You're early teens, and tell me where you start modeling. You've got this. I'm sure you find a spot to set it up, and tell us how you kind of progress from there.
I think for the first couple of years, it was quite often I took over the dining room table, which was okay in our house because the dining room only ever got used at Christmas. So I'd have to clear it for Christmas, but then I'd have it for the rest of the year. And I would, for my birthday's in late January, so not long after getting the first train set, I was able to get another loco. Grandparents bought me track and tunnels and things. So it's kind of, you start with that basic train set and you just expand it and expand it and expand it. But I think for me, what really happened was I was at an age where I didn't just want to build a train set. I wanted to find out about the actual railways itself, because up until that point, I only ever saw trains as being things like the Orient Express or the Santa Fe Super Chief, strangely enough, which I had heard of. But it's trying to find out that more kind of mundane, everyday bit of the railway. And so I started buying magazines, reading books, and obviously no internet back then to go and find things out. So I spent time in the library doing it the old-fashioned way. And I started to then go what we call train spotting. I think you guys call it rail fanning. So I would go out and I would find places to go and look at the trains. And where I lived at the time, we lived quite far out in the countryside, and there was one branch line that came out. But because we lived near a nuclear power station, there was a facility at the local railway station for loading the waste onto trains so that it could be taken away. And I found out from one of the guys that worked at the railway station what day and what time that train would come in, because it came in once a week. And I would go down there and I would watch the train and see that little bit of something different, because over here, especially where I live, there aren't many freight trains. In fact, there are no freight trains where I live. Everything's just commuter trains. But that was just something a little bit different. And then, and I did confess to my mother a few years back that I would start going up to London on my own to go and see the trains, because we're
statute of limitations have run out on that. Huh? You can finally tell her.
Yeah, so officially she thinks I started going up to London when I was 16, but I've been doing it since I was about 15. But called no mobile phones back in those days, so nobody could track where I was. But I would go up to London because we're only about 40 miles from London, and I would go and there's a big station just on the outskirts of London on my railway line called Stratford, which is quite a major interchange now. But back in the 80s, there was the huge depot was there with the engine shed with all of the locos, etc. So we'd go down there and try and get a glimpse of, something that, again, we wouldn't see elsewhere on my part of the line.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that rail fanning influence, and like you call it train spotting in the UK, we call it rail fanning, and that ability to get trackside and absorb all that. How were you able to apply that to your model railroading at that point?
I think a little bit. I think it was an interesting time for railways in Britain because it was before privatisation happened, so it was still British Rail. And when I started, everything was blue. Everything was that British Rail blue, coaches were blue and grey. There was no variation to that. But when I started getting into model railways, things were changing and we were going into what we called the sectorisation era, where Intercity as a brand came along. The railways around where I live became what was called Network Southeast. So all of the trains were red, white and blue. they looked like toothpaste. I was quite often, they were quite often compared to, I think it was the old Signal toothpaste we had over here. And it became, you could see that it was moving towards that getting ready for privatization. But it was an interesting time because we got all of these upgrades. A lot more lines were electrified. We moved away from the old, what we call slam door trains, the ones that you could open yourself, which were great because as you pulled up to the station, you could open the door and jump off before the train had actually stopped. But we then got the push button sliding doors and stuff like that, which are never as much fun.
Maybe a little safer, but not
a bit safer, but not as much fun. And you couldn't open the windows. I mean, these days you go on a heritage railway and they say don't stick your head out of the window because something might hit you. Well, we learned how to safely stick our heads out of the window, shall we say, back in the 1980s. My stepson, whenever he comes with us on one of these things, I mean, he's grown up now, but I taught him how to stick his head out without losing it. So, but yeah, it was a really interesting period, and I think when the times that I have modelled British railways tends to be that era, that late 80s, very early 90s, because it's the bit that I remember from when I really got into model railways. But quite difficult to do because unfortunately, whilst a lot of British trains are multiple units, you can't get that many models of multiple units over here sort of ready to run. And especially where I live, where it's all done by overhead wires, they're very few and far between from that era. But there are ways around it, So I have modelled that sort of scene because it is the bit that I remember the most.
I was going to ask you that, as you talked about getting your information from libraries and doing all that research and reading magazines and the sort. What was the availability for, what did you have for hobby shops around you? And was there ample supply and that ability with brick and mortar locations or?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, back in the 80s, most towns had at least one model railway shop, if not two. So the town that I live in, or the city that I live in now, Southend-on-Sea, I mean, I came here to go to what we call sixth form college, and there were two model railway shops, one of which I got to know the owner very well. And as an adult, I used to help him out occasionally. And I got a lot of advice from him and the people that were in the shop. But even growing up, I can remember as a small kid, there was in the town that we used to live on the edge of London when I was very small. The town that I lived in, there was about 3 or 4 model shops. And then when we moved away to the countryside, there was nothing. But my grandparents still lived on the outskirts of London. So I would go back there, spend weekends there, go to the model shops. And I had one granddad, my granddad Charlie, who on a Saturday, he would just say to me, right, where are we going today? And he would drive me anywhere in London to go to whichever model shop I'd seen advertised in a magazine, just to go and, see if they had something different from all of the other model shops.
Yeah, that's always a fun to see. I always figured that, these hobby shops and whenever I travel, here, I still have that belief. Like I go into a local shop and I hope to find local flavor, right?
Yeah.
If I go to a hobby shop in Albany, New York, I'm hoping to see, obviously CSX, and I hope to see Susquehanna. And if I go to a little hobby shop in the northwest corner of Connecticut, I hope to see, Housatonic and all the local railroads. And sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. Did you find that being some of the differences, kind of local flavor in these shops?
I think at the time there wasn't a huge amount on offer that could give you that local flavour. And I think as well, because British Rail was pretty generic in what it did across the country, there was some variation. There was some stuff branded for Scotland and there was some stuff branded for Wales and etc. But you tended to find that most model shops had the same thing. I think what was important to me, and this probably goes on to when I started modelling or getting into American stuff, is that there were specialist retailers that specialised in either American or European railways. And they were the ones that I certainly, in my later teens, that I started to want to go to because they had the stuff that was really interesting and unusual because it wasn't the everyday British stuff that was being made by Hornby and Lima and then Bachmann when they started with their British range.
Yeah, what was the kind of the balance there? Was it, heavily American over British, even in the UK shops? Was it, or was it like a 50-50, or how was it kind of the availability of European versus US? It seems like you're maybe saying US had a little bit more better availability.
Um, in the average model shop, you probably wouldn't have found any US or continental European railways. It would have all been just British.
Okay.
There was I think there's always been quite a strong following for both American and continental railways. So over here, our oldest model railway magazine is called Railway Modeller. It's kind of our version of Model Railroader. It's been around for 80 odd years. They have a sister magazine, which I think they started in the early 80s. I certainly started picking up in the late 80s, called Continental Modeller. And Continental Modeller, it's a much smaller magazine, but it features basically modelling from any railways from anywhere else around the world apart from the UK. And I can remember when I started it was published every 2 months. It's now published monthly. It's almost as popular as Railway Modeller. It's like the availability of things like, the other day I went to my local newsagent and I picked up this month's issue of Model Railroader. So it's actually quite easy to get the American magazines over here now. Whereas 20 years ago, you probably wouldn't have seen them apart from in very specialist places.
Let's talk about that transition, because I mentioned early here that it fascinates me that you end up with an American railroad to model. Let's talk about how that progresses and how that develops. I mean, you're talking late teens that this idea starts to come to fruition.
Yep. I firmly blame Budweiser for my interest in American railways. So I'm probably going to have to give that a bit more context than just that.
I'm sure Budweiser's been blamed for a lot worse and a lot worse decisions. But yeah, sure. But let's blame it on the beer. Tell us how that happened.
I know we start drinking earlier over here in the UK than you guys do in the States. But it wasn't because of that. So. In 1989, when I was 16, my parents took us on a family holiday to Florida, and I was quite excited. I'd always wanted to go to America. If you were a kid growing up in the 80s in Britain, you probably had a little bit of an idolization of America because it was bigger, it was more exciting, and so when my parents said that we're going to Florida, I'm thinking, fantastic! I'm going to go to America and I'm going to see American trains. I was desperate to go and see something because by this point I was really, really into railways. And we got to Florida, we stayed in Orlando like most people do, didn't see a single train, didn't see a single model railway shop. The best that I got was going to, I think it was Toys R Us, and picking up some lifelike bits and pieces, which, whilst they're very basic by today's standards, actually, compared to some of the British stuff, they weren't bad. But certainly the motors were a lot better. But we went to Tampa Bay and we went to Busch Gardens, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners will remember. It was built around the brewery where they made Budweiser. Yep. And I was 16. So when we got to these theme parks, my parents just basically said to me, if you want to go off, here's $50 for food and stuff. You go off, we'll see you in a few hours' time at such and such a place. So I'm wandering around Busch Gardens and there's a connection to the railway, and a train came in and I stood by these gates for must have been 2 hours watching this switcher switching these box cars. I don't even remember what freight cars were there, but I'm pretty sure they were reefers, box cars, that kind of thing. And I spent a couple of hours just watching this locomotive, pushing, pulling. Anyway, I met up with my parents a couple of hours later and they said, we've been on this ride. What did you do? I'm like, I watched them shunting, because that's what we call switching. I'm like, I watched a shunter, Mum. And she goes, you spent 2 hours just watching a train? I said, yeah. And that was it. And so while I was there, as I said, I picked up a few lifelike bits. One of them was it was a Santa Fe Alco Century 628. It was made by AHM, I think. And I got one of those. I got a Bachmann Jeep, lots of stock cars and various bits and pieces. And I also picked up a Bachmann N-Gauge train set. It was the one with the Santa Fe F unit and a couple of cars and a caboose.
Yep.
And got back to the UK, and I just before we'd gone away, I had taken what we call my GCSEs. There are a certain set of exams that you have to take at 16 over here. And I did very well in them. My parents said, "Oh, we're going to give you a little bit of money." So as soon as I got back, I made my way out to London to a shop called Victor's. Now, Victor's it's been closed for quite some time now, but it was in Islington, just along from King's Cross Station, which was dangerous in itself because King's Cross was not the nice, clean, lovely place that you see in Harry Potter these days. It was a little bit dingy and a little bit not where you'd want your 16-year-old son to go. But I went to King's Cross, went to Victor's, and Victor's specialised in American railways. And I picked up it was a Bachmann F40, couple of Concor superliners, and a few other bits and pieces, and some N-scale bits as well. And I kind of started transitioning my British train set, as it were, to become an American train set. And then eventually with the HO stuff, that dwindled. And whilst I was in my late teens, when I was at college and stuff like that, I concentrated on American N-scale. And there was an article in the Continental Modeler, and somebody had built this beautiful Santa Fe base layout called, I think it was called the Tacomano Valley. I don't know where they set it, but there was fir trees, and the railway station was the little Atlas station that's been around for, I think, longer than I have, and I just decided, right, I want to do something like that. So my dad built me this kind of, must have been about 5 foot by 3 foot tabletop in my bedroom. And I started building an N-gauge layout. And yeah, predominantly Santa Fe, but obviously a little bit of Amtrak in there. And yeah, and that kind of, as I got older, that kind of died off a little bit, got back into British stuff. And then probably my interest got re-sparked when I was about 30 in American railroads, because I went to America 3 times that year. I went to New York, and then to Los Angeles, and then to Chicago. And whilst I was there, obviously, I went and looked at trains and went to train stores and bought loads and loads of stuff. And that's when I started properly getting back into it. And also, I think sort of like, we're talking about this was 2003. So we're talking about the dawn of the internet. So information was easier to come by. And I was able to actually model stuff a little bit more accurately than just throwing together a load of American bits and pieces.
Let's go back just a few seconds ago when you mentioned, we were talking about N-scale. I'm just kind of curious, what got you started in N-scale? Was it the idea that you were going to do N-scale? Was it because of availability, or just perchance that what you purchased was N-scale, or was that an intentional decision?
I think it was almost a perchance thing initially. So when I was in the States and, I was in Toys R Us and looking for the trains, there happened to be this little N-scale train set that had everything in it, which was great because it meant that whilst I was in America, I could set this up on the table in the hotel room and actually just run a train around, which was, great fun. And I think what I noticed with the N-scale that was produced, and this was, relatively basic Bachmann stuff, was it was still much better mechanically than the N-scale we had over here in the UK. The N-scale we had over here in the UK was built by Graham Farish, which is now part of the Bachmann brand. But back then, it was open frame motors. It was well known for being quite finicky, and people would burn out motors quite quickly, and it wasn't easy to repair them and whatever. And the Bachmann stuff was just, you could throw it around the room and it would still run when you then put it back on the track. And as well as that, there were, because Bachmann had entered the British scene by that point, you could actually order some of the Bachmann American stuff through, if you had a local Bachmann dealer, they would be able to put in an order for you with Bachmann and get you some of the American stuff. And I just kind of got into N-scale that way. And it was a bit of it was availability. It was relatively easy to get hold of compared to the HO scale stuff.
That definitely makes sense, availability and, I'm just curious if, N scale was a space constraint, because one of the things I guess maybe, we hear a lot about, layouts in the UK is space restraints seem to be like kind of the thing. And they're really kind of the leader in this shelf layout kind of philosophy. And I was just kind of curious if it was a space constraint, but definitely makes sense.
Absolutely. I mean, part of it was space, which is a bit weird because my parents actually have quite a big house by UK standards. And I had some space that I could have used for the layout, but never did. But certainly in my bedroom, N scale, it was easier to do a circular style layout in N scale in a smaller space than it would be to do it in HO or OO scale. And I think that probably drew me to it initially. And I think as I've got older, I don't need a roundy layout to have fun anymore. Right. For me, it's very much the shelf layout, the end-to-end, being able to do the switching, et cetera, et cetera. Watching trains go by is great fun, but I certainly don't have the room for it these days. But I also don't have the eyesight for N scale.
So get us back to your trip to the U.S. You said New York, L.A., and Chicago.
Yep.
Yeah. What do you remember of the rail fanning that you did here? What were some of the things that laid an impression on you?
I think so. I think certainly is starting with New York. I probably didn't get as much out of it from a rail fanning point of view than the other two cities. At that time, I didn't realize that had I gone across the Brooklyn Bridge and, got onto the Long Island Railroad and stuff like that, I would have found much more to see. Whereas as a Brit, when you go to New York, you tend to stay on Manhattan Island and you go to Grand Central Station, you go to Penn Station, you see those kind of things, you ride the subway, and that's about it. LA was a bit different. I did go to LA Union Station. I did spend some time watching the Metrolink trains coming in and out, seeing some of the Amtrak trains, and then the freight trains going through, which was quite exciting. But probably for me, of the three, the best one was Chicago, because obviously Chicago is known for its railways. It's known as, is that kind of hub. And even in downtown Chicago, you can't miss the railways. I can remember going on I had my first ever ride on a double-deck train in Chicago. I went on the Metro Electric line down to the Science Museum, and I absolutely was sitting upstairs. I wasn't sitting downstairs. I was sitting upstairs because this is something I've never done before. But of course, you can still see freight going through. You then got all the commuter runs. And I think for me, Chicago was a great place because I didn't have to go very far to find what I was looking for. And I think with LA, certainly at the time, there was a lack of public transport compared to what they've got now with their light rail, etc. So getting around LA was difficult. And whereas with Chicago, it's quite easy. So there was stuff that I think if I look back now, if I was planning those trips now, I would do them completely differently. And I would have done my research, and I'm planning hopefully next year to come to the States again. And I will be going to New York, and I don't think I'll be going anywhere near Manhattan Island. I will be spending my time in Brooklyn and Queens and going on the Long Island Railroad and seeking out the New York and Atlantic and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, that's there's a lot of, and then even just, you head just a little bit north out of there, you catch the river line with CSX coming down through there. If you want to catch class 1 stuff, there's definitely, but inside New York City is a little tough, but definitely being able to get outside of it. But boy, you hit a hot spot in Chicago. Like you said, just all the hub of, railroading. Did that start to, when you get back to the UK after a trip like that, you've seen all this. I mean, what starts to unfold from there?
So I think that my mind at the time started moving towards, okay, I've been to Chicago. I think I could model something set in Chicago. And so the first thing I did was I got I think it was a Walthers F40 in Metro colours, a couple of their gallery coaches. I got, I think my freight locos tended to be BNSF, because I think Santa Fe was quite an early influence in my railway modelling career, as it were, from an American point of view, BNSF being their successor. So I thought, right, get a BNSF loco, stack cars, or, but they put the containers on. And I thought, great, I've got all of this. But at the time I was living in a flat that was so small that I could barely put together about a four car train without having to open the door onto the balcony to let it sort of, so I had all of these grand ideas, but I had absolutely nowhere to put them. And I can remember just having a couple of boards and just starting to lay some track and thinking, okay, if I do this as a kind of sectional thing that I could then eventually, when I move somewhere, build extra sections for it and bring it all together. But it really didn't come to anything, and which was a shame. But it wasn't until my next move that I actually had space that I could actually build proper layouts. But by that point, I'd kind of moved back into building British stuff. I kind of went through little phases of British American. I even stuck a French period in there for at one point where I had dreams of building somewhere in the south of France. But again, a lot of these things, you buy the stuff, it becomes a pipe dream, and then you think, nah, do you know what? It's not worth it. And then you sell it on, and then you end up, I think I certainly, from my modelling point of view, I've ended up exactly where I want to be. And I can't see me modelling anything apart from North American railways, except maybe as a little side hustle. Do you know what I mean? Have a small little shelf somewhere that I can just put something back with, that I can run odds and sods on. But my main layout is definitely going to be American going forward.
Being open-minded and having multiple interests is a challenge, isn't it? I know I've got my good friend that we pick on the show here, Joe Mammy, who, he's bounced around a couple different layouts, and, I think he's maybe finally decided, but every once in a while, a thought creeps into his mind that, oh boy, I see, somebody did something in the Lamoille Valley, or they did, something else, and he'll start to, wander a little bit, and it's got to be tough, but, I admire folks that are like single-minded focus, because, that it's definitely got to be a lot easier than those that go, oh, I really like NS, but I like CSX too, or I like British railroading, or I like you said. Do you know what in you sparks that change? I mean, you talk about the wave. What was the kind of what kind of sets you off back to a different, kicks you off the path onto something else?
Sometimes it's a new model being released, and it could be as simple as I like the color scheme, or I like the look of the engine. And a couple of weeks, or about a week or so ago, Hornby did their annual 2024 release video, and I was so happy that there was nothing that they announced that I would want. Because, and I was discussing this with a friend of mine over here, and we were both saying that our wallets are staying firmly shut this year thanks to Hornby, because they haven't announced anything that we would think, oh, that would make me want to move. I think the closest I've got is Hornby have reintroduced what they call TT scale, the TT 120. And I have got a locomotive on pre-order. It's the British Class 66, which is the EMD built engine. It's got the 710 prime mover. And yep. I've always wanted a model of one of them. Never particularly liked the 00 scale models. And as I said, N scale, I've got a little bit of it, but I do find it a little bit too small for my eyesight now. But this TT one, I'm quite interested in. It's sound ready and whatever. And I thought, do you know what? That's the kind of thing. It's small enough that I can put it up on a shelf above me, and just have it as a little shunting layout, or as a little traction depot that I can have. But that's the only thing that's kind of caught my eye. But I don't want to build a whole layout with it. I just want to, have it on the side, as it were. It's a side hustle for me.
Well, it's funny that you're rooting against these manufacturers of sorts of going, please don't put anything out, but you are watching. So so there's a little bit of you that's kind of hoping to see something, although you maybe, your heart and your mind battling with each other as they're coming out with these new releases.
Absolutely. Had they announced certain electric multiple units, then I would have been hard pressed not to think, I might save my money and get one of those. But again, the problem is when you get these kind of 4-car units, you've got to have somewhere to run them, and
Right.
space isn't my friend, unfortunately, when it comes to railway modelling in the UK. I've got a very, very small, compact space. So, yeah, it doesn't lend itself to that kind of thing. But I still probably would have bought one anyway, just for the sheer hell of it.
So we kind of got off a little bit, but we were talking about, when you got back, you're starting, you've gone through these, phases, I guess we can call it, of, different ones. What kicked off the one from the south of France? Did you end up going there and seeing it? What was because that's, you're going British, US, and then you mix in France. How did that happen?
I like to think of it as my French period. I seem to be, my wife says that I must have a certain degree of, I don't know, neurodiversity, because when I get into something, I get very into something. And I did a couple of trips to Paris in relatively quick succession. And of course, while I was in Paris, I found where all the model railway shops are. They're all in a little cluster, strangely enough, not far from the Moulin Rouge. And so I went there, and I went to all of the big railway stations, which are great places to go and see the trains coming in and out. And in France at the time, they still had a lot of locomotive hauled trains, whereas over here we don't. And I just kind of like the look of them. I don't know if you've ever seen the electric locos they have with the swept-backed windshield that look quite snazzy. I think they designed them back in the 60s or 70s. And I managed to pick up a couple of bits, obviously, while I was there, and then get back over here and suddenly find, it's quite easy to buy this stuff in the UK. Hornby had just taken over Jouef, which was the main French company, and started producing under their Hornby International brand. So I didn't even have to, shop around. I could go onto Hornby's website and order French stuff if I wanted to get it. So I got a few bits and pieces. I got some kits that I painted up, and I came up with this idea of this little kind of bucolic branch line somewhere in southwestern France, and there would be vineyards and etc. etc. And then the Rock Island Railroad turned my head, and that was it. I sold everything and started buying bits and pieces to do with the Rock Island, and that was it. That was France. Goodbye. We love you, but no, it's not going to happen.
Where did you get influenced by the Rock Island?
The Rock Island, again, is one of those railroads that I probably knew about long before I got into railways. Certainly the whole concept of the Rock Island Rocket as a train. And it probably came from some movie that I saw when I was a kid, or a cartoon or something that came from the States. And I think there's a guy over here called Peter North, who built a series of small layouts, which were featured in Continental Modeler. So over a period of about 15, 20 years, he did these small layouts, and each one was set on the Rock Island, and they were ramshackle, run down. You had, their idea of a passenger train was an F unit with a combine and then a boxcar behind it. But most of it was this whole kind of, this dying railroad. And I just loved the look of it. So I started looking into the Rock Island and sort of, found out about the fact that, it went bankrupt in 1980, and, it was one of the last holdouts of its own passenger trains. It didn't sign up to Amtrak in the 70s, etc. And I managed to get hold of one of the Proto 2000 BL2s, and I got one in Rock Island colours. And I don't know about you. I know that a lot of people think of the BL2 as being one of the ugly ducklings, but I love them. I think they're beautiful locomotives. I think whoever came up with that design styling must have been tripping or something. They were amazing. But I got this BL2, and then I started building up a few box cars and bits and pieces. When I was in Chicago, I managed to pick up Proto 2000 E8 in the Rock Island Rocket colours. Got a few coaches, etc. So again, I had these grand kind of dreams, and then everything kind of got filtered down a little bit. And so I got rid of some stuff, and when I started planning the layout that I've got now and started thinking about, well, what do I want to run? I started to think about, do I want to do the Rock Island? Do I want to do somewhere on the Rock Island, maybe in the Chicago area? I've got one of the Walthers F7s in the lovely fire engine red colours and a couple of gallery cars. And I was thinking, do you know what? I could even have a little commuter train that just shuttles backwards and forwards, but then lots of very, very dirty rundown engines. But then again, something else caught my eye, and I suddenly realised that actually I'd much prefer to model something that's more up to date than the Rock Island. I have still got a lot of Rock Island stuff. I can have Rock Island operating sessions on the layout if I want to, but it's the Rock Island is, for me, it's my favourite fallen flag railroad. It's the one that interests me the most. I think probably because it is a little bit of it's the railroad that seemed to punch above its weight, and I quite like that. Quite like the underdog.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. So let's talk about your current layout and how you land on that. And what I'm really curious about is, you mentioned the, early impressions from Busch Gardens and watching switching there, and as you call it, shunting, and Chicago, you talk a little bit about passenger stuff. And I know now that you're doing a linear layout, you're not doing, a circular roundabout layout. Tell us how, operations and that, point to point got into your modeling.
2 words: Lance Mindheim. So I discovered Lance's books probably about 18 months ago. And I read his book about how to operate a shelf layout, because I was thinking a shelf is going to be what I need to do. And I kind of had a very small shelf layout, which literally had one turnout on it, and I could just run things backwards and forwards. And I could do whole switching sessions on it quite happily. But I thought I just need something bigger. I need something where I can split trains up and put one in one siding, one bit in another, and take from here and there. And I think it was Lance's books that kind of showed me how I could turn that into reality. And over here in the UK, we don't have those kind of short freight trains anymore. We don't have those local trains where somebody will pull into a siding and drop off a few cars and then pick some up and then go on to the next siding and do the same. And we don't have that, which is a bit of a shame. It's probably why I never got into freight operations in the UK. But with American railroads, you still have that. I love the whole idea of the short line. And I think that I think it works really well in that small space. You're able to fit a lot more in and get a lot more bang for your buck, as it were, by having that kind of smaller switching layout. So yeah, it was kind of a bit out of the blue. I think that I had to very much kind of put on the back burner my love of things. I really do love commuter trains because that's the kind of trains that I've always grown up with. And so it's kind of, because of where my layout's set, I can kind of pretend that in the background somewhere in the great wide world, there are commuter trains going past. I just don't happen to have them running on the layout. But I know that it's kind of set in that thing. And the other thing is, as well, is obviously my layout is set slap bang in the middle of Brooklyn. And I love that kind of urban railroading, that feel with the buildings and things being hemmed in and closed in. I find that quite an interesting thing to model.
Yeah, you mentioned something thinking about, and maybe it's just a very simple thought, but that is one sacrifice of the small switching layout, is if you have a love for commuter trains, it just doesn't fit. I mean, you think about it, it's like, okay, yeah, you could run it and it just goes from end to end. I mean, yeah. I know my layout, it'd be silly to put commuter on there because it would be going from South Plainfield to North Plainfield, which is just one town, right? So it wouldn't make sense, and then you'd have no place to put it. And so I guess that is, some of the things that you have to sacrifice to, for the base constraints and whatnot. It really is designed for a specific purpose, which is switching.
Yeah, and I think there are ways that I kind of get to satisfy my love of commuter trains. So, for example, on the layout, I've got a single New York subway car. It's one of the lifelike, I think it's an R17 in the Redbird colours. And I kind of occasionally attach it to one of my trains because in my world, it's being transported from one place to another for use at the New York City Transit Museum or something like that. And so you can get glimpses of that kind of railroading without having to actually run a train. It's just, that's something that's there.
Yeah, that's definitely a creative way to mix that in.
Yeah, and I've got things like I picked up one of the Atlas New Jersey Transit double-decker coaches, and I've got no use for it. I'm not modelling New Jersey Transit, but again, it could be just being transported somewhere as part of a larger freight train, and might just have an appearance in the yard because it happens to be attached to the train that's going from A to B, but has stopped there just to drop off a couple of boxcars.
Yeah, that makes sense. So tell us about your current layout, how you ended up where you're at with the road that you've chosen. And I know that you provide a lot of great updates on your YouTube channel on your layout, but why don't you give us a summary of what you have going on right now?
So the layout it's an L-shaped shelf layout. So the scenic area is 8 foot by 4 foot, and I have a 2.5 foot extension. It's just literally a single line that goes across where the door is, and that can lift out. There are, I think, 6 switches in total on there. 4 of them lead off to sidings with, I think one's on a lumberyard, one's on what's going to be a brewery, one goes to just some warehouses, and one goes to a scrapyard. There is a little runaround loop so that I can get the locomotive from one end of the train to the other. It's set in Brooklyn. It's called Brooklyn Park. I chose the name because there is actually nowhere in Brooklyn called Brooklyn Park. I've done an extensive search. There is a place called Brooklyn Park up in Minneapolis, but that's it. So I've reappropriated the name and moved it back down to Brooklyn in New York. And it's basically it's a fictional yard off of the Bay Ridge branch of the New York and Atlantic Railroad. So that's where it is at the moment. It's taken a little bit of development. So I knew what space I had. I knew roughly what track plan that I wanted. I used SCARM just to sort of plan it out. And it's made I use Pico track, so I use their code 83 US outline track. I wanted to use their code 70 that they've just brought out, but you just can't buy it over here. I think they're shipping it all over to you guys in the States. We can't get our hands on it.
Swallowing it right up.
Yeah. But so it's built using that. So I kind of had the track plan, but originally I was going to base it in Oklahoma. And this is because of a guy called Alex Bogaski, who's got a YouTube channel called Red Dirt and Rails. And I got very friendly with Alex, and he models Farm Rail, which is in Oklahoma. And again, my head is very easily turned. I saw the locos. I thought, wow, I love these. So I got a couple of locos. I got a GP10 and a GP38. The GP38 I had to detail myself because it was a basic Athern model. And then I thought, okay, I can have a grain silo here, and I can have a animal feed business there. But the more I got into it, the less I kind of was enthusiastic about the whole countryside kind of setting. I think that I'm a city boy by heart, and it just didn't satisfy me in the way that I thought it would do. So I started looking around, and I thought, well, maybe I could set it in Chicago, perhaps somewhere on the Indiana Harbor Belt, something along those lines. And I then discovered the New York and Atlantic Railroad, and I kind of fell in love with it because it's a short line, but it runs mostly on the Long Island Railroad. So it had that crossover between the commuter and the freight traffic. But of course, I wanted somewhere that I could model that was not on the commuter lines, mainly because A, you can't buy the model trains, B, I haven't got the space for it, and C, I really hate fitting third rail. It is the most tedious job on the planet, second only to ballasting, which a lot of people who know me know that I really hate ballasting as well. So I felt, great, New York and Atlantic Railroad. My problem then became that there are virtually no models, ready-to-run models of New York and Atlantic Railroad trains in HO scale. I did a bit of research. Atlas had produced one or two. I think they produced an MP15 and a GP38, but they're long gone. If you can find them, they're like gold dust.
Yep.
Athen did a couple of GP38s, and that was about it. And I managed, Christmas before last, I found a used Athen GP38-2, number 261 in New York and Atlantic colours. Basically, it was on eBay. They would ship to the UK. I said to my wife, that's what I want for Christmas. So she said, fine, buy it, get it shipped over. It arrived about 3 weeks before Christmas. She let me take it out of the box just to make sure that it was working, etc., etc. Put it back in the box. She wrapped it up. And in the meantime, I had bought all of the detail parts that I needed and the sound decoder and the LEDs, etc., etc. And my little project from Christmas Day until about the mid-January was turning this from a basic Athen ready-to-roll loco into the loco that I've got now, which people can see. I've done a couple of videos about it. It's got ditch lights, it's got headlights, it's got the I think you call them the class lights, which they use as the rear lights, red lights on the New York and Atlantic. It's got all of the correct cables, snow plows, etc. And it probably cost me as much in detailing parts and decoders and things than it actually cost my wife to buy it and get it shipped over to the UK. But so I've got one. And Athen Genesis have just announced that they're going to do a run of the MP15s in New York and Atlantic colours. And I've got one of those on pre-order with Train World in Brooklyn. I thought, fine, I'm getting a pre-order for that. I'm going to get one of those. So I at least get two locos. But what I've done with the layout is I've stretched reality a little bit in that I'm allowing CSX to do some run-throughs. So the New York and Atlantic interchange with CSX at Fresh Pond in Queens. And so in my world, CSX has a few running rights on the Bay Ridge branch. So I get CSX trains go through as well.
Yeah, you took some artistic license. You've discovered the proto-freelance mentality, and you've been able to apply that. And a couple things struck me as you were telling that story. One is, another comparison back to Joe Mamian. Boy, when you come over to the U.S. next, you'll have to meet him because you're like-minded. You know what you want to do for operations. You know what the area is, and then finding a railroad to match it, where usually, at least I think it goes the other way. It's like you fall in love with a road or you fall in love with an area and then you model it. It's like you knew what you wanted to do operations-wise. Now let's find something that fits that bill. And that's what you've done here with the New York and Atlantic, and then mixing some CSX in there for, some for run through power, and you'll be able to fill that void until you get enough for your New York and Atlantic. And the second half of that is when you're planning a railroad, knowing that too, that if you pick a road that there's a lot of non-production of models in, you're going to have to ebb and flow your story a little bit until you can get your roster built up.
Oh, absolutely. And I think as well, you have to be a little bit kind of flexible because it's like with the GP38 that I've got. So the model isn't exactly accurate for the actual real life locomotive because the molding wasn't quite right. If I'd managed to get one of the Atlas ones, it would have been nigh on perfect. But unfortunately, the Athen one was, I think it's what you call the anti-climber at the front, is a slightly different shape than the one the one that the New York and Atlantic actually have on number 261. But then I'm a great believer in what I call the 90% accuracy, that as long as it's about 90% accurate, I'm happy to go with it if that's the only way that I can get the exact model that I want. And it does work. And I mean, you're saying about, deciding on what you want. And I think I did find a railroad that fitted all of the bits and pieces that actually appealed to me. The trains are quite short. There's, quite mixed traffic. There's a bit of lumber. There's a bit of, scrap metal, etc., etc. But I could also add into that, because I've got a fictional brewery, that I can add in things that would be taken, sort of grain, etc., would go there that you wouldn't perhaps have in real life on the actual railroad. And I think that's the important bit for me, is being able to flex things. And at the end of the day, we call it rule number one over here. It's my railway. I'll do what I want, but I want to do it relatively accurate to the prototype.
Yeah, it's you to the level that it makes you happy and makes you feel good about it and makes you feel like it's a good representation of what you want it to be. Is that brewery going to be an Anheuser-Busch facility?
No. I was I was looking at it, and there's a beer over here called Brooklyn Beer, which I first had when I was in the States, back when I went to New York in 2003, and they have a brewery in Brooklyn, but it's not rail served, and it looks nothing like the building that I'm going to be using as a brewery. So I will come up with a fictional brewery name for it and my own fictional beer. I think since the whole area is fictional, I could probably get away with that. But yeah, I just need to get to grips with what goes in and out of a brewery from a railway perspective. It might just be that they ship the beer out in boxcars and stuff like that. But yeah, I need to come up with that, and I probably need to come up with a logo for it. So yes, something will happen with it. But no, it won't be Budweiser. It won't be Budweiser.
So you've got your layout underway, and you're working on things. Obviously, you're adding a brewery and all these other things. Where did the inspiration to start a YouTube channel on this come from, and what birthed that idea?
I think there's a little part of me that always wanted to be famous. And I quite like being able to share things with people. And so I over the last, I think probably about 2.5 years ago, I started putting odds and sods of bits of video onto YouTube. I had a YouTube account, so I just bits of trains that I'd filmed. There was no narration, there was no introductions, there was no production values whatsoever. And I'd always liked the idea of being able to put together railway related videos, either railway modelling or actual going out, seeing the trains and whatever. But I didn't know how to edit. And being a man who, I mean, I've not long turned 50, but being a man in his middle ages, you do find it a little bit more difficult to learn these things. And you kind of think, oh, no, I wouldn't be able to do that. And for work, for some strange reason, they asked me to do a one-day course on how to make videos and edit them on your phone. And so I thought, okay, I'll give it a go. And I did it. And I realized that actually editing wasn't that difficult, and that I could make these videos. So I then last year bought myself a laptop, because I haven't had my own laptop for ages. I've just been using my work laptop. But of course, my work won't let me download any software onto it. So I bought myself a laptop. I downloaded and paid for a video editor, quite a good one. And I started actually producing my own videos probably about more than a year ago, because I first started doing it on my phone. But again, eyesight's getting worse. You need a bigger screen to be able to edit properly. So yeah, I started editing these videos together, and it's just grown from there. And I like to think my production values have got better and better as the videos have gone on. I've certainly got a close friend of mine who I've known for a long time, who owns a model railway store over here, who, like most of us Brits, is quite sarcastic and is probably my biggest critic when it comes to my videos. But he has said that when I first started doing them, I was quite stiff, and he said it wasn't you on the video. He says, but now it's you doing the videos.
It's not easy, is it? It takes a lot of time, and boy, I can go back to the first episode of this, or 2 or 3, and I could definitely hear a difference in myself. And then I'm sure that when I listen to, go get to an episode 120 and I go back to 60, I'll hear a difference. I put up recently kind of a comparison between model railroading and these, the type hobbies, whether it be podcasting or YouTube. And, it really is. It's just like the hobby. You learn as you go, and you'll develop new things. And every interview I do, I learn something new, or a different question to ask, or a new technique. And I'm sure that's happening for you as well in these YouTube videos.
Absolutely. And I find that, sometimes I will go in. So I'm preparing some intros and bits for a model railway show that's happening in London in March. And I've decided I'm going for the whole weekend, doing both days of the show. But I want to do an introductory video before the show, and then do 2 others. And I've started making just the logos and the intros and the, and whatever. And I decided, well, because I've got the time, I'll play with it, and I'm finding new bits of animation that I can put in and things that will just make it look a little bit more professional, and adding some different music, because I do get criticized with my videos about putting music in them. Some people don't like the music at all. Some people don't mind it in certain places. For certain things, I quite like music, but I've found that if I go to train shows, no music at all is the best policy. People want to hear the hubbub and the hustle and bustle and just have it unfiltered. But I'm finding some new music. My original intro music, which unfortunately I don't have available anymore, which is quite a good thing, because my mum likened it to, let's just say, adult movie music from the 1970s. And she said, the problem is every time I heard one of your videos, I expected some Swedish guy to walk out and do something rude. But my current music and my current intro music is quite short as well. So that's again something that some people like. But yeah, putting music on videos, I do get a bit of criticism about, but I have quite angrily said to people, well, they're my videos, so if you don't like it, you don't have to watch.
That's also a good theory. I mean, I think once you put your heart into it, you do good. And if you have any bit of understanding as to what entertainment is, I think folks look at that and you'll follow. You've built already a great following of 600 subscribers, and I'm sure that's going to just continue to grow as you put out good content. And ultimately, if your viewer is getting something out of it, that's all. That's really a huge driver to it. And seemingly you're sharing all your travels, and I think people can relate to that, and that's a huge part of it.
I think so. And I think what I found interesting is that, I tend not to do how-to videos because they're actually quite difficult to film, because you've got to get the camera in a weird position, and it doesn't make it easy to actually do it. But the videos that I found that have been quite popular are where I've shown people how to do stuff that it's like I use NCE PowerCab, and I love it as a controller. But I noticed watching one of Larry Puckett's videos that he had the amperage come up on it. And I'm like, well, how do I do that? And I trawled through the instruction book, and you have to really read it properly to find where it is. So I thought, I'll do a video about it. And I got loads of comments back with people saying, this is really helpful. Thanks for showing me how to do that. I never knew how to do that. And again, when I fitted ditch lights to the GP38, people still contact me and saying, how do you fit ditch lights? Because a lot of older models just don't have them, and they're interested in how I do the wiring and stuff like that. So I quite like putting those videos out there, because it is about sharing what I've done and what I've got and how I've done it. And I think that, I do get a lot of good feedback. I would like a lot more subscribers though, please. So anybody listening, please feel free, click subscribe. The more the merrier. I'd love to have a lot more subscribers.
We're going to definitely send them your way. We're going to share the link here. It's you can find you on YouTube at The British Railroader. Yeah. And we'll put the link in the show notes. We'll also provide it on the Facebook post when the show airs. Thank you. Folks can go on there and click there. Make sure you subscribe, hit the bell, do all those things that you're supposed to do when you go to a YouTube channel, and definitely check out what Steve's sharing. And maybe that'll be the profound saying that I'll have you say here at the end, which is the hobby is so much better shared. And I think that's what you've learned with your YouTube channel, and being able to share out what you've learned and share your journey there. And boy, just really cool, and love the fact that you're putting that out there, and really happy that you decided to join me early this morning here in the United States and about midday there in the UK come and share your story here on Around the Layout.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've absolutely loved it. I quite like listening to the sound of my own voice. So this is probably the medium that works quite well for me.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Around the Layout. Learn more about today's show on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Around the Layout. Show your support by becoming an operating crew member at patreon.com/Around the Layout podcast. Past episodes and more can be found on our website, aroundthelayout.com. And send us your feedback, aroundthelayout@gmail.com. Thanks for hanging out with us around the layout.